Aenig by Cáel. Chapter 32. Cáel barely noticed the bulk of his stunned audience leave. He was confused by his own reaction to how roughly Damien had handled Max. He hadn't even been paying all that much attention, but he'd known when the older scouts had grabbed the Mev, and he'd responded with something that didn't feel like it came from him. He wasn't even aware that he could. I didn't know humans could make that sound. Ndi's comment interrupted his panicked contemplation, much more softly than it usually did, perhaps because she had spoken his inner thoughts out loud, or perhaps her tone was soft and inquisitive. Doc might not have been totally right about your lack of change. So what am I then? He wondered, before shaking his head hard. Ugh, whatever. Without Max tucking him back in every time he tried to get up, Cáel finally managed to crawl out from his nest to stretch his cramped muscles. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been immobile for so long. A fascinating new specimen for you to dissect, I suppose. Fascination may be pushing it, the girl answered matter-of-factly, as she rummaged through a drawer to produce a syringe and thermometer. Cáel could hardly be taken aback by her blunt response. Dylan got that way too when he was heavily focused on his work. Maybe there was a reason the two had clicked so quickly. They were much more alike than the scouts had ever wanted to admit. Inexplicably, the nagging sensation of jealousy didn't flare up when he thought about it now. How strange. Despite the very lovely excuses Dylan had made for him, Cáel felt guilty enough about what he'd done to at least admit that he had done it because he was upset that they'd been getting close. You admitting I push your buttons then? He smirked to cover himself. He watched her sigh in mild irritation. He could see the effort it took to hold herself back from fighting with him. Her scientific curiosity kept her personal annoyance in check in a big way. A comeback caught in her throat, heavy like bile on her tongue, but if she spat it out, they would never get the examination done. So she simply settled on, I need to take your temperature, and hoped the scout would drop it. Fortune smiled on the two that day, and Cáel lifted his arm without complaint, but the lack of sleep and the man's uncharacteristically cheery mood were playing with her inner comedian, and Ndi simply couldn't resist shaking her head. She cocked an eyebrow at him. He looked confused for all of 2 seconds before her eyes dropped down his body, and the most justified blush splashed over his cheeks. Cáel chuckled hesitantly. He refused to acknowledge the heat in his face. You know, he started, his arm lowered on reflex. If you wanted me out of my pants, there are so many other ways. The girl's face twisted up in disgust, though she still laughed, and the scout found that he liked the sound. As I have said before, the idea alone is gross. She held the thermometer out to him. Now, put that big mouth of yours to use, old man. Obviously, he was relieved to discover that she had been joking, but he had never seen her look so at ease before. Well, around him at least. She was quite pretty when she smiled, though that couldn't be why Dylan liked her so much. Pity, Cáel knew he couldn't compete, and he honestly wasn't mad about it now. 22 is hardly old, he huffed, plucking the thermometer from her fingers. Shut up and suck it, she finally managed once her laugh had diminished to a chuckle. Still too old for someone who regularly throws tantrums. Then I should be too young for you to be making such jokes around me. He cocked his head curiously as he took the thermometer and popped it into the corner of his mouth. Ndi was surprised he'd actually done as she'd asked. Who knew that all it would take to turn Cáel 6 into a somewhat cooperative human being was a Memph bite and a death scare? Although, now that she thought about it, it kind of made sense. Our banter is on the level of prepubescent boys, she shrugged. If it stimulates you enough to keep you out of my hair, why would I complain? Oh, come on, the man whined around the tube. You've proven more than once that you wouldn't participate if you didn't want to, or at least enjoy it a little. Ndi huffed. So help me, Cáel. I will shove that thermometer down your throat if you ever insinuate that we have anything in common again. Just the challenge he was looking for. I would love to see you try. I can see that you're feeling better, she smirked. The small machine beeped, and she held out her hand for it. Though you should watch yourself. You've been down a long time. I could probably take you right now. Keep telling yourself that, Pipsqueak, he scoffed at her, and handed the thermometer over cordially. It tastes funny, he commented at the aftertaste the metal and disinfectant had left on his tongue. Did you wash it after you stuck it in that corpse I bought you? Ndi thought about it for a little longer than strictly necessary, not even attempting to hide her chuckle as the scout pulled the most disgusted face. Probably, she finally answered. It read 240. She reached up and set the back of her hand against his forehead. He was definitely warm, but he didn't look feverish. She checked the display again with a frown. Maybe Doc would find it useful. Can I ask you something? Cáel wondered aloud, her hand still pressed to his forehead. Yes, you're still an asshole, and yeah, Dylan would have cried if you died, she replied simply, as she did math in her head and ran through a mental list of the medicine Aisha had left in her desk drawer. Why did you help look after me? I mean, we're not exactly friends. She raised a curious eyebrow as she removed her hand from his face. Really, I want to know, the man insisted. If our situations had been reversed, I would have put a bullet between your eyes and dumped your warm corpse over the hangar ledge. Ndi's features settled into a deadpan glare. You are aware that there is a difference between honesty and simply being a dick, right? She was clearly annoyed by the confession. He nodded, though still looked as though he expected an answer. She sighed and moved to toss the thermometer back into a drawer. I was the only one willing to stay and study Max. He was worried, and taking care of you made him open up to me. To her utter amusement, Cáel actually laughed. Good to know, the man smiled. I guess that's good enough to call a truce. Thank you, Ndi. He stuck out his hand to her. She regarded it cautiously, but ultimately squared her shoulders and shook it firmly. His tummy rumbled, and the entire city shook. Ndi's eyes blew wide, and Cáel blushed sheepishly before his features shifted into confusion. I'm pretty sure that wasn't me. The elevator dinged, and Max sprinted into the room, grabbed for both of them, and hurled them back towards the metal box. The scrawny little guy was hella strong. Max! Ndi chastised belligerently. What the hell are you doing? The Queen is here, and she brought an army, Max explained, almost too fast for the words to make sense in the midst of the full-blown panic attack. Cáel shoved the man's hold off and turned on his heels back into the lab. Cáel! The man shrieked helplessly. Didn't you hear what I just said? Calm your bloody jets, half-breed, the scout drawled back, as he snatched up his bracer and slipped it over his wrist. He didn't even flinch when the needles slid back beneath his skin and the little machine whirled to life. There's no way Damien's leaving me out of this.